Good afternoon, folks. I'm Gabe Horowitz with Third Way, and I am really excited about the large crowd we have here today. Large crowd because housing, let's be honest, has such an outsized impact on our economy. Looking broadly, home ownership accounts for a significant portion of families' net worth. And residential construction provides for almost 1 million US jobs. And all in all, housing represents about 18% of US GDP. But we all know housing is a lot more than just macro numbers. Especially over the last 2 years, your home was more than a basic necessity. It was your office, it was your daycare, your school, it was your doctor's office, and it was your social scene. And unfortunately, for many families, housing is becoming more and more of a burden. Housing prices are up 18% over the last year. Mortgage interest rates just hit the highest they've been in a decade. Supply of houses is low, and a whopping half of renters find costs to be a burden. So we have a lot to unpack on this critical issue, and thankfully we're joined by some really insightful people. So here's how today is going to work. We are lucky to have Gene Sperling with us at the top. And many of you know Gene. He's the only person who has served as the director of the National Economic Council under 2 presidents. And he's currently President Biden's American Rescue Plan coordinator and senior advisor, which means that time is super limited. So I'd like us to hear from Gene for a few minutes before we let him go, and then we'll open it up to a broader panel. So Gene, thank you for joining us. I know things are incredibly hectic right now. Let me turn to you. The American Rescue Plan became law about 13 months ago, and it was a massive effort in what was a really scary time. So I'd love it for this crowd if you could unpack a little bit about what ARP did specifically for housing, why you think it was the right approach, and how you think it's going.
Well, thank you very much. Thank you, Gabe, for the introduction. Thank you to Patty for reaching out to me. Thank you to the panelists coming after me. Lisa Rice and I have worked for so many years with all sorts of different hats, but always about fair housing. Erika is really my partner at the White House. She's really the central person inside the White House at the Domestic Policy Council for all housing, but she really was my partner in working with Treasury, HUD, with everyone on all of the issues that rose on the American Rescue Plan. And I'm going to give a shout out to Bryan Greene, even though I'm not sure how much we've met before, because Bryan in his spare time is a writer, believe it or not. And Bryan wrote an article in the Smithsonian recently about my father-in-law, my late father-in-law, who was an amazing man. He was Stevie Wonder's manager. He was top executive at Motown and the president of Motown for 2 years when Superstition and Sunshine, and Stevie Wonder's Sunshine of My Life and Marvin Gaye's Let's Get It On went out. But he had another claim to fame. When he worked at VJ Records, he was the first person to sign the Beatles. It's a piece of history that matters a lot to our family, but didn't always get recognition. And as we were together for my mother-in-law's 80th birthday, Bryan Greene's piece comes out in Smithsonian documenting the role that my father-in-law played. And let me tell you, I don't imagine when you wrote that, you would have known that his widow would be there with tears in her eyes, reading that story with her family, really out loud, but I owe you one. So, but just as a writer, not in your current job. All right, so thank you to everybody. Listen, you guys have an all-star panel coming on and you have Erika. So I'm making a little bit of a decision here that I want to talk about something incredibly important to the housing community that is a key part of the American Rescue Plan, and that is evictions. And I realize we're talking about housing supply and home ownership, but as Gabe said, this is more than numbers. This is about our values. This is about what it means to be housed, to have safe housing. There is a lot in the American Rescue Plan. The home program was 6 times larger than usual at $5 billion. We had 70,000 emergency housing vouchers, which we know are so critical to affordable housing, preventing homelessness, and the fact that there were 200,000 proposed as part of the Build Back Better top priority for this administration. We have the housing $10 billion HAF program. And one thing that people don't realize is that the state and local program has had the largest contribution at all. There have been $13 billion already devoted to housing and homelessness prevention from mayors and county leaders who got their state and local funds. So there is a lot more than maybe meets the eye, particularly when you look at the $350 billion state and local program, because as we say, even a portion of that can have an impact that we don't see or have not seen before in previous programs. But I wanted to take a word to talk about the emergency rental assistance program, because for me, as the coordinator of the American Rescue Plan, it wins the award for the slowest, most frustrating, then fastest, and in many ways most rewarding, or one of the most rewarding programs in the American Rescue Plan. And the reason that it was both frustrating at the start, why it's, I think, rewarding, so important for people to understand, really derives from the same fact, which is we as a country had never had a national eviction policy, even during serious downturns. And importantly, we as a country did not have a national infrastructure for eviction prevention. And that is the situation we came into this pandemic with. So we were asked, those of us implementing the American Rescue Plan were essentially asked to try to start from scratch, not in one central government program, but in over 400 state and local programs, often from scratch, an eviction prevention strategy and program that had to be started under enormous stress, that had to get cooperation from landlords and tenants, not always the easiest relationship, but in one of the most stressful and difficult periods in our country's history. And we did not have time to wait for, controlled experiments that would come out from 2 years from now. I mean, Mike Tyson the boxer is famous for saying, my opponents come with me at strategy and I just hit them in the face. Well, you're taught about how you're going to do brand new evidence-based, random controlled trial experiment, and then you get an emergency program like this and life hits you in the face. And so you have to do everything you can to learn what's happening on the ground. We spent enormous time at Treasury, at the White House, talking to advocates, to grantees, to landlords, to anybody on the ground, understanding anything and everything that was happening. And we made every adjustment we could make based on what we were hearing. And those adjustments in May and June and August, and the clarifying that self-attestation and simplified forms were important, and that since we still had documentation on the lease, would also be not subject to abuse. These things were critical because we faced a race with time. We knew that this startup had to get going by the time that the national moratorium on evictions ended. And I will say that as tough and rough as it was, and as uneven as some of the national performance were, that goal was in many ways largely met. By the time the national moratorium ended, we were providing payments to over 500,000 renters and landlords each month, which is something that had never been done or even close to done in the history of our country. We did everything we could, from White House summits to getting PayPal to advertise, to put, link on how to get assistance, anything and everything we could do. Now, there is no shortage of analysis, and there's no shortage of articles and people writing, looking for each thing that didn't go right or is still not going right. And these are incredibly important. Every avoidable eviction is an avoidable heartbreak, and we should be doing every single thing we can to stop them. And we are still working on this. But we cannot also lose the big picture, which is that our country, for the first time in history, put in place a national eviction prevention strategy and asked it be started up in a year in the middle of a crisis. And at this moment, 5 million payments have gone out, 5 million to household and landlords. There's never been anything like this. And when Erika and I were asking experts in June and July what to expect when the moratorium ended, we were told to expect that for several months, there would be double to triple the amount of evictions. Newspaper headlines called it a potential tsunami. Well, it's been, by the best measurement by the Eviction Lab, they have not only not been a tsunami nationwide in the 6-7 months since then, it has only been at 70% of historic averages. That is quite an indication of how much policy, even first time, even with all the flaws, all the challenges, all the uneven performance across the nation, matters and has mattered. And the funds that were going out slow, we now think $30 billion has been spent or obligated, and that the money will run out this year. And so the program in which people thought it was going out too slow, the greatest challenge we face now is that the money is actually running out. But I will say that this now leads us to an issue, which is this going to be a national teaching moment on evictions in our country? Are we satisfied to just go back to the status quo? Matt Desmond estimates that and the Eviction Lab estimates that 3.7 million eviction filings happen a year, and that the normal amount of money owed was $500 to $600. Yet we allow evictions. There are many courts that serve as virtually eviction factories that just process evictions, despite the fact we know this has long-term negative impacts on families and children that have serious consequences from a dignity, from a humanitarian, and from an economic basis. Now, we never just focused on just the funds going out. We focused on reform. We did 3 White House summits on eviction diversion, both so we could slow the evictions happening during the crisis, but also so that we were using this crisis to have longer term reform. We had the Associate Attorney General, Vinita Gupta, wrote a historic letter to every court in the country. The Attorney General himself brought together all the state Supreme Court justices and asked them to look to how to do court diversions. We had 99 law schools and their clinicals agree to focus on this. But this is not magic. There hasn't been a sudden change. We are seeing right now that when people don't do reforms and when the money runs out, evictions start to creep back to their historic averages. Of course, policy matters. When we have policy and funding in place, I believe millions of evictions were prevented. Millions of families are going to be in stronger, better shape. Their children are going to have stronger futures. So as I speak to this whole housing community, knowing that you're going to get to issues of housing supply and affordability and incredibly important issues with the fantastic panel you have, you are still part of the larger housing community and part of the larger values and ethics. The book I wrote before I came was called Economic Dignity. I just can't imagine what it must be like to have to tell your children, not that you lost a job, but that you're being forced out of your home, that you might have to go to a shelter, that you're not sure that the family can be together. Is that going to happen sometimes in our country because it's unavoidable, because people have abused their lease and things? Of course. But we should ask ourselves, should this be a national teaching moment as to where evictions can be avoidable, where they can be prevented, whether we want to leave something going forward that's a little more humane has a little more economic dignity. And I think that this is the moment for us now to ask that question, even as we deal with the larger housing affordability and supply issues that I know your panel will get to. So thank you very much for giving me that chance to hit on another very important aspect of housing in the American Rescue Plan. And I think, as going to what Gabe said, those things that go beyond the numbers, our values, our sense that everybody should be able to raise their children and family with a degree of economic dignity. So thank you very much.
Gene, we thank you for being here. Thank you for your service, all your leadership on these issues. I have about 400 questions I'd love to talk to you about. We'll do that another day because I know you have to run.
Another time.
From all of us, thank you for your time.
Thank you.
And while Gene signs off, I'm going to ask our other panelists to turn their cameras on. And while they're doing that, let me just remind people who we have with us this afternoon. First, we've got Erika Poethig, who is at the Domestic Policy Council. She's Special Assistant to the President for Housing and Urban Policy. We've got Bryan Greene, who's with the National Association of Realtors, where he's VP of Public Advocacy. And we've got Lisa Rice, who's President and CEO of the National Fair Housing Alliance. Now, as Gene pointed out, there's a lot of ground to cover. And what I'd like to do first is explore some of the pressures facing families. Gene mentioned one, there's a lot more I'd like to get into. Then we'll look at what needs to change. And if we have time, we'll talk about how we actually bring about that change, since there's so many policymakers with us on this Zoom today. So let's waste no time. Let's dig in. Erika, I'm going to turn to you first. When it comes to housing, Gene mentioned evictions, but what are some of the other issues that you're tracking at the moment?
Thank you, Gabe. Thanks for the invitation to be here. It's wonderful to be on a panel with Bryan and Lisa, two people from whom I learned so much and who are leaders in the field, and to be with an audience that you've gathered here virtually. So I see many friends on this Zoom, and hello to them as well. And of course, to follow Gene is an honor. So let me just put this in context. We are obviously facing today one of the most significant housing affordability and supply challenges that we've ever faced, but it's decades in the making. It didn't just happen during the pandemic. It is the result of something that's been building for decades, and especially for the lowest income Americans and for people of color. There isn't a county in this country that has enough affordable housing for people with extremely low incomes. And that's been true, again, for decades. And that's why rental subsidies that Gene mentioned that fill the gap between rents and what people can afford are so essential. But since the Great Recession, our housing supply gap has been growing. Housing production fell off quite significantly after the recession, and today, by some estimates, we're short somewhere between 4 to 5 million units of housing to meet the demand. Now, some of this is also just demographic change. So as millennials, second largest generation to the baby boomers, started to form their own households, they started to demand housing. That demand for new homes at a time where we have not seen enough construction created a lot of competition for available housing supply. That competition has driven up housing prices and the cost of housing, not just for the lowest income Americans, but for people across the income spectrum, including middle-class households. And we know that communities are just not producing enough housing for a variety of reasons. But one of the leading reasons for the lack of available housing is a lack of land available for building. And state and local regulatory barriers, some of which have their foundations in the racist housing policies that were permitted at the federal, state, and local level and still exist today and still are in the books in some cases today, are preventing builders and developers from responding to this demand in more responsive ways. And so, of course, there are supply chain issues. People are unable to complete the building that's been started. But we also know that not enough labor and availability of financing in some cases are also causing a challenge. But the administration, who really sees that this land use and zoning challenge is central to meeting our goal of creating more equitable access to homes for both renting and home ownership. Now, good news today is that we are seeing some promising trends in boosting supply. Housing starts are at their fastest pace since 2006, and that will help ease prices over time. But President Biden believes the best thing that we can do to tackle these challenges is to boost housing supply and housing supply that is safe, affordable, and available to every community. And the mismatch between supply and demand of housing, again, is structural and longstanding, but closing it will require a lot of decisions, a lot of courage at the federal, state, and local level so that we can really address some of the longstanding issues that we face.
Erika, thank you for that. And I want to stay on this issue of supply, and I want to turn to Lisa. Erika mentioned the shortage of housing. It's a massive topic. I'd love your take. How does this shortage impact underrepresented communities?
Well, Gabe, thanks so much for the question and for inviting me to be here. It really is a privilege to be on this panel with Erika and with Bryan, and of course to be in this work with people like Jean, with Jean Sperling. So this is a great question, and it's a difficult one because it's a packed question that you can't really answer looking just at isolated factors like the supply issue, right? Because there's so many elements that are driving the inequalities that we're seeing. As Erika so profoundly stated, this housing crisis isn't the result of some new issue. We've been having a housing crisis for decades now. And in the 40s and the 50s, we established government policies that were directed at meeting the housing supply needs of everyday people, right? We focused on building and developing affordable housing. We called it workforce housing at that time. And we also focused on developing a finance system and a whole structure that would enable the building and development of affordable housing that would provide people easy access to that affordable housing that was being developed. The policies were developed based on the needs of people and not on just the needs of corporations. And that's a big difference that we haven't seen over the past several decades. But the problem is, of course, Gabe, when we built and developed all of those millions of units of affordable housing, we did it in a deliberately discriminatory fashion. And we created systems for doing so because we built that housing in an exclusive fashion. We didn't design the systems to be inclusive. We designed them to be exclusive. We didn't want free, fair, and open access to housing opportunities. We wanted very limited and restricted access for who could get those resources. So we use mechanisms like restrictive zoning ordinances and racially restrictive covenants and segregation and redlining policies to direct where those resources could and couldn't go. Well, guess what? We left all of those structures in place, as Erika noted. So all of those restrictive zoning ordinances are still in place. Those policies that perpetuated appraisal bias are still in place. That is why today, homeowners in Black communities are losing about $156 billion in equity due to the undervaluation of properties in Black communities. People of color are still experiencing grave difficulties in accessing housing opportunities, and in particular, wealth building opportunities like homeownership. The white homeownership, the racial Black-white homeownership gap is larger today than it was when the Fair Housing Act was passed. The white homeownership rate is 71% higher than the Black homeownership rate. It's 50% higher than the Latino homeownership rate, and 20% higher than the Asian homeownership rate. And those disparities are all directly connected to the wealth gap. Black households with children have just 1 penny of wealth for every dollar of wealth held by white families. That's literally a penny on the dollar. Latino families just have 8 cents of wealth. So these policies, this crisis that we're facing is having devastating impacts on households of color. And it's why we've got to implement equitable housing policies so that we can fairly address this crisis that we're in.
Lisa, there's a lot to unpack there. I'm going to come back to you in a minute, but I want to bring Bryan in on this. Bryan, before we start digging into some of the things that need to change that Lisa brought up and that Erika brought up, I want to get your sense of what other pressures out there are realtors seeing from their vantage points in every congressional district, in every community, really across the country.
Yeah, well, thanks, Gabe. And it's great to see Erika, my former colleague, and great to see Lisa, who I've known since we were kids. And she's such a valuable voice to this conversation. And I also want to acknowledge Gene and his shout out at the beginning of the program. Those are words every writer wants to hear, but can never expect. So really appreciate it. What NAR really brings to the table here is that we're the nation's largest trade organization with 1.5 million members nationwide. And so when we roar, we're heard. And on this, as we roam this savanna that is Washington, we've been roaring about housing supply and what our 1.5 million members are seeing throughout the country, what they are seeing in those congressional districts, and the impact that it's having on consumers. And I want to say, really, I think ultimately the impact that it may potentially have on the fabric of our nation. Consumers out there are struggling to achieve what their parents did because of the housing supply shortage and the record high prices. So our members, they talk to members of Congress about this. They will be here again next month talking to policymakers and members of Congress about these issues. So that's one direct way in which we spread the word of the issue. But then beyond that, we have one of the best research teams when it comes to housing. Many of you are probably familiar with my colleagues, Lawrence Yoon and Jessica Lautz. You see them on TV often discussing these issues. And they're putting out the research and have been putting out the research calling attention to these issues. And policymakers are listening. In fact, I was on a panel discussion earlier today, and the Bipartisan Housing Council was citing our research, as were others, specifically on this housing supply issue. And let me stress, the Bipartisan Housing Council. So we are reaching politicians across the aisle, both sides of the aisle, to raise these issues. And so one major study we put out was about the housing supply shortage just 2 years ago. Which the White House has also tweeted out about, and demonstrating that we are being heard on this. But then just recently, we put out another study called Double Trouble about the record high prices and the low inventory, and more specifically, the impact it's having in specific communities and the impact on different demographic groups. And as I say, this does tear at our foundations if we don't get on top of it. It's, as Erika said, decades coming. It's going to take some time to get out, but we are collaborating with groups. Lisa and I are both part of the Black Home Ownership Collaborative that's working on this issue, and hopefully we'll get into some of those solutions we've been advocating for. But just generally, we as realtors, because of our presence throughout the country, are sort of the canary in the coal mine. And when the air gets thin, we start squeaking.
Bryan, that's a perfect segue, because I do want to start talking about solutions now, especially because our time is tight today. And Erika, let me start with you. We've obviously talked about with Gene pieces of the American Rescue Plan and the implementation of that, but I want to look ahead and ask you what the administration's priorities are to address housing, both thinking about availability and affordability. What are some of the top issues, top solutions that you guys are looking to usher forward?
Great, thanks, Gabe. So we're going to always continue to advocate for the kind of transformational investments that were in the House passed reconciliation bill, including the housing supply investments. You may have seen in the FY23 budget proposal, we proposed on the mandatory side a $50 billion housing supply fund as part of that budget proposal. We're going to continue to press forward on that, but we also aren't waiting. We're looking to every tool available to use federal policy to boost supply and incentivize change at the state and local level. Now, last September, we rolled out a series of executive actions that are estimated to add about 100,000 new units for rental and home ownership over the next 3 years. Agencies report that we've already created 10,000 of those units that we projected creating. Watch out, watch this space, larger space. We have more to come on that front. We continue to do the couch cushion strategy, I call it, which is looking for, again, every available tool that we have through administrative actions. And these are, thinking about the ways in which we can incentivize zoning and land use reform to permit gentle density, new and improved financing tools for rehabilitation and new construction of small multifamily housing, again, for both home ownership and rentals. One of the things we know is we don't have enough move-in ready homes. And Bryan can probably tell us better than anybody, but new household demand wants a more move-in ready home. And the kinds of financing we have to do kind of purchase rehab is not as robust as we need. And so looking at ways to build that kind of financing so that homeowners can purchase and rehabilitate housing to meet their family's needs is, again, some of the kinds of tools because of the federally guarantee and backed mortgages that the agencies across the government offer. We do have more tools in that space. We're also looking at ways in which to make sure that as we provide subsidy and financing, that we are reducing transaction costs and enabling housing to be built more quickly. So housing supply has been a focus, will remain a focus because we believe it's essential for reducing housing costs. Now, expanding affordability is critical. The president's budget included a request for 200,000 new vouchers in FY22. We got 25,000 of that request. We repeated the request for FY23. We're very hopeful that Congress will continue to make an investment in expanding rental assistance because we see it's a critical, even if you build the supply, there's still an affordability gap for so many Americans. So that remains critical. And then I would just double down on something Lisa said too about making sure that first generation, first time homeowners have access to opportunities, that affordable opportunities to become homeowners is also critically important goal. And so making sure there's affordable access to credit coupled with down payment assistance that enables homeowners of color to access and build wealth is also an important objective of the administration. That's just a sampling of the things that are important to us, but want to turn it to others.
That's a great roadmap, Erika. Thank you. And let's actually go to Lisa next. Lisa, what are some specific policies that you're advocating for that you think will make a real difference for that new home buyer?
Sure, Gabe, thanks for that question. You noted, I think Bryan noted earlier, the Black Homeownership Collaborative, which is comprised of about 100 organizations from different sectors, lenders, real estate experts, developers, advocates. It's a multifaceted group. And we've developed a proposal called 3 by 30. We want to get 3 million new Black homeowners in 10 years, 3 by 10, I'm sorry. And that program really recognizes that the problem wasn't created by just one group, right? The problem was created by many, many different actors, and it's going to take all stakeholders working collaboratively to address this crisis. And I think we're on the way to doing that, Gabe. So we are collaborating on implementing more special purpose credit programs. These are programs that are allowable under the Equal Credit Opportunity Act. And I got to give a shout out to both the CFPB and HUD, who have both issued guidance that is resulting in more lenders developing special purpose credit programs. We need programs for socially and economically disadvantaged groups. And here again, I have to give a shout out to Erika and her team for ensuring that there was a carve out for socially disadvantaged groups in the Homeowners Assistance Fund. Erika mentioned a proposal that the National Fair Housing Alliance developed in collaboration with the Center for Responsible Lending and with support from research by the Urban Institute, the first generation down payment assistance program that really is a way to direct benefits to African Americans, Latinos, Native Americans, and other people of color. If we fully fund our first generation down payment assistance program, we can really we can make significant inroads in terms of closing not only the racial homeownership gaps, but the racial wealth gaps. So that's just a couple that I'll mention, Gabe.
And Lisa, before I turn to Bryan, can you just one more time for the audience, is 3 by 10, it's a fascinating initiative. I want to make sure people have that. Is 3 by 10 is the name of the initiative?
It's the Black Homeownership Collaborative. And our major effort is 3 by 10. We want to achieve 3 million net new Black homeowners in 10 years by
Excellent.
2030.
Great. Bryan, let me turn to you next. I just want to make sure we got that for the audience. Tell us a little bit about what role private sector organizations like the Realtors can play in solving some of these issues, and if there are any specific policy priorities that you'd like to see thinking about the end of the next year and the year after.
Yeah, well, we have been attacking it on several fronts. And as Lisa pointed out, with the Black Home Ownership Collaborative and the goal of 3 million new Black homeowners by 2030. And, that actually has a 7-point plan, which lays out many of the things that we've been advocating at NAR. And it's obviously great to be in this great company. So, down payment assistance is key. A lot of states are doing that very effectively. There should be a role for the federal government on that as well. Advancing alternative credit, Fannie Mae's taken the lead there and recognizing the importance of looking at rental income. But, we need to be looking at utilities. We need to be looking at people's overall share of expenses and how they manage that, because there's opportunity there for qualifying people and for sustaining homeownership if we alter the model a little bit. Special purpose credit programs, lots of promise there. The Black Homeownership Collaborative has been advocating that. Lisa Rice took great leadership in getting clarity on the legal issues. I was with Comptroller Michael Sue earlier today, and he had really sanguine things to say about the prospects of special purpose credit programs, suggesting that once they see what's possible, it may pick up. So I think those things are critical. But the big challenge is that even doing all of those things, it's going to be hard to keep up with the ever rising prices. And then having on top of that, the increase in interest rates. So we have to address the root cause of a lot of this, or what will bedevil even some of the best plans, which is the lack of housing production. And building is going to take a long time. As Erika said, we're a decade or 2 decades in the hole. So we've got to start. But we're challenged by supply chain issues, of course, and labor shortages. So we must address all of those. But there are a lot of things we can also do immediately. So we're very pleased to see the Neighborhood Homes Investment Act passed. We want to see that enacted so that we can actually, begin to rehabilitate homes and have more resources for new construction. But we also can repurpose some existing property. We at NAR have been advocating for the conversion of some commercial property to residential. So we have malls and we have hotels that are not being used because we have 100-year low in birth rates. There are a lot of schools that are just sitting empty. So we should take advantage of these structures and convert. And I think the federal government can help with tax assistance so that companies can do this. Then we've talked about what we can do to maybe even reduce capital gains, to promote the sale of single-family homes that are currently rented, the sale of those homes to first-time home buyers or owner-occupants rather than investors, because we did see a lot of homes go into the investment side of the ledger after the recession. If we could actually see some of those homes on the market and make them available exclusively for owner-occupants, that would be great to incentivize. But just overall, we need to advocate that this is a national priority. We really do need something like a Marshall Plan to get this moving. And I think it will come. And I think the real question is, whose name is going to be on it, So we just have to get it started.
Thank you for that. Look, we are just scratching the surface, and I know we're about to run up on time, but here's how I want to close it out. I'd like, just for 30 seconds, no more, I'd like to ask Bryan and Lisa one takeaway, one piece of advice you have for the federal policymakers, since we have so many on this Zoom. Just one thing. Erika, yours is slightly different. When I was on the Hill, we didn't love the administration telling us what to do. So I would like one piece of advice from you for the entire housing advocacy community, that the rest of whom is on this Zoom. So Lisa, let me start with you. We'll go to Bryan next, and Erika, don't make me do the big hook. Let's just keep it really brief, but one piece of advice. Lisa, we'll go to you next.
We have to continue working collaboratively. We've gotten a lot done working collaboratively and intersectionally on qualified mortgages and FHA reform. We're beginning to do that on appraisal reform, so we got to keep going.
Perfect. Bryan?
Well, housing has long been the American dream, and we need only look at the challenges of the next generation. Are they going to be able to realize the same dream? Look at student loan debt, look at all of these challenges that right now are burdening young people as they try to follow the footsteps of the older generations. So that's the future, and our policymakers need to look to them.
Thanks for that. And Erika, take us home.
Yeah. Housing is an immensely complex issue. It's one of the reasons why I love this field, is because it keeps me on my toes. But I think we have to simplify the way we communicate the challenges to build support among the American people for solutions. And I think, just to underscore what Lisa said, we need to, as a field, work collaboratively. The complexity leads to a lot of silos. We have to pick some priorities and get them over the finish line.
Amen to that. Guys, thank you for joining us. To the folks in the audience, really appreciate your time this afternoon and tuning in. Into our panelists, to Erika and Lisa and Bryan, thank you. Thank you for your expertise and for your insights. I wish we could do this for another hour, but I know folks have schedules. So enjoy your week, and we would love to continue the conversation.
Thank you, Gabe.
Thanks for having us.
Appreciate it.
Bye-bye.